Well, hello, everyone. Welcome again to our session of Reading Pilgrimage Together, our monthly discussion of Dorothy Richardson's wonderful masterpiece, Pilgrimage. This month, we'll be talking about Dimple Hill with our special guest, Dr. Annika Lindskog from Lund University in Sweden. But before we get into that, I'll just give a few comments about where we are and what's coming up for the reading group. So if you'll bear with me. So here we are again, next to the last session. So it's been a great journey here together. People have been sharing and continuing to share thoughts and passages using the Pilgrimage Together hashtag on Twitter. Of course, I'll still be making this available information and background material on the Reading Pilgrimage site. So here we are in November with the next to the last volume of Pilgrimage, Dimple Hill. Quite a different change of setting and content from what we've been used to. This is the first, other than Oberlin, that takes place mostly outside of London. And coming up, so this month we have Annika with us. And then we're going to take a break and not do one in December, but wait until mid to late January when we'll both talk about the last book and kind of have a reflection on the whole series, since that'll give us all the time to get through it and kind of let our brain cells germinate for a while about thoughts about pilgrimage as a whole and what the reading experience has been about. And so I have invited all the past guests. Obviously, not all of them are going to be available, but a couple of them have already confirmed that they're going to take part, which is going to be great. And I think in the last couple of days, if you've been following Twitter, you saw that Amy Helms and Kim Askew, who run a podcast called The Lost Ladies of Lit. This is a session that Scott McCracken and I did with them in October, where I talked to them about featuring something about pilgrimage and Dorothy Richardson, and they agreed somewhat cautiously. And in thinking about how we should approach it, I decided to jump kind of midstream and have them read Dawn's Left Hand, because they always read the book before they have the session with the guest, because I thought that kind of caught pilgrimage in the midst of in mid maturity, so to speak, and I think it was a great discussion. So I highly recommend you listen to that. It was a lot of fun, and actually they've both written to me afterwards to say that they're going back to Pointed Roofs and they want to read the whole series, which is fantastic. And so today we're talking about Dimple Hill. This actually never came out as a separate book. It was first published in 1938 when Dent, the Crescent Press in the UK, and Alfred A. Knopf in the US jointly published a 4-volume edition of Pilgrimage that included all the already published chapter volumes, as well as Dimple Hill. So you don't find, although you see some reviews, there weren't a lot of, people didn't review Dimple Hill as a separate book. And likewise, you won't see separate reviews of March Moonlight, which only came out in 1967 when the next collected edition came out. And so today, without further ado, we'll introduce Annika, who has agreed very kindly to participate. She's written on Richardson, not only in a book in the context of modernism with Joyce and Woolf, and those of us who are Richardson fan are so happy to see that that's the triumvirate, because too often there's only 2 names mentioned out of the really monumental modernists. So it's nice to see Richardson mentioned. And she's published some very interesting articles in the Journal of the Dorothy Richardson Society that I would highly, all the articles and the archives of the Dorothy Richardson Society Journal are online. There's some really terrific articles. I really highly encourage kind of her supplemental material, going back and looking through those, because some great stuff to be found. So with that, let me stop this and let me make Annika the host. And for some reason, Annika, I'm not being able to co-host as a choice, which I'm used to on Zoom. I don't know why that's not there today. But just when you are done, if you will turn it back to me so we can do moderation. Okay?
Yeah.
Thank you very much. And over to you, Annika.
Okay, thank you very much. I have some slides I wanted to share with you too. So let me just see if I can get them up there. Can you see them now? Yes.
Yes.
Great. So I'm so happy to be here and talk with you today, or tonight for me, because it's past 8 o'clock. I'm not naturally a night person, so I hope this is not going to be a problem. I didn't dare have any coffee beforehand because I thought I'm not going to be able to sleep, but I did have some sugar. So let's see how this goes. So it feels like such a treat for me to be here and to talk to people who have not only heard of Dorothy Richardson, but who have actually read her. This is very unusual in my experience, except for, the Dorothy Richardson conferences. So this is very exciting for me. And I'm also happy to learn that there are people like Brad out there who are working to establish Richardson's place in the world as a central modernist writer and as an important 20th century writer, a position that I think she very rightly deserves. And I think we're getting there, but slowly. So I've been reading Richardson regularly since about 2007, when I first read Pilgrimage and just fell in love with the text. And I decided that this was the writer that I mostly wanted to focus on for my PhD. My supervisor said that I had to bring in other writers too, and that's why Joyce and Woolf entered this.
Excuse me, Annika, I'm sorry to interrupt, but some of the folks in the chat are saying that they're not seeing the slides. So I'm seeing it, so I'm not sure why.
No,
not
could I just
everybody's able.
explain?
Okay,
we are seeing...
switch to standard view. Okay, so if you're watching, make sure that your view is on standard view and not gallery or something like that, and then it should be fine. So sorry for the interruption there, Annika.
Okay, someone now is saying seeing the slides but not Annika, but perhaps that's not a major problem if you can hear me. I think you can fix this somehow, like if you get up to the menu. I'm not sure. Is it okay?
It's fine.
Yeah.
Annika, if you spotlight yourself, you have a choice. If you choose the little option in your window, if you do spotlight, then everybody will see you. There we go. Perfect.
Okay, lovely. Okay, I'm spotlighted. This feels very fancy. I haven't been on Zoom for a while because we returned to the classrooms here in Sweden about, in the spring. So you fall out of the habit. Okay, so getting back to Richardson. Right, so I wanted just to show you, let's see if I can just find where to switch this. Hello. Okay, now we're jumping. There we go. Okay, so I wanted to show you just this picture of my monograph, which came out of my dissertation, and which has 2 chapters on Richardson, and which is focused on silence in many different ways, which is, as I hope you realize now that you've read Dimple Hill in particular, an incredibly rich topic when it comes to Pilgrimage, which is just full of silence of different kinds. So this is something that I hope maybe we can talk a little bit more about today, how Miriam sort of seems to find her way, perhaps not home, but home in herself in Dimple Hill, realized in these experiences that she has of silence and of nature and of silence in nature, etc. But this isn't just blatant self-promotion. I wanted to show you also this picture of this tree that I chose for the cover of this book. It's a photograph by the pioneering photographer Henry Fox Talbot from the 1840s. And I chose it partly because Richardson once described consciousness as sitting stiller than a tree. So I thought this was a very fitting image for that. And she said this in 1934, at which point she had already started working on Dimple Hill. And I think it's such a relevant quotation in relation to this novel chapter in particular, because of the deep connections that Miriam experiences with nature and with her inner self. And I'll return to this in just a little bit. So I thought I'd just tell you a little bit about what I prepared to talk about today and what I thought we could talk about together. So I have some background about Dimple Hill in particular. And then I thought that we could talk a little bit about the novel as beginning and ending of Pilgrimage, which I think it does. And you're nearing the ending of reading Pilgrimage too. So that seems apt, and perhaps in relation to the title of the entire sequence, Pilgrimage, and the religious connotation. So religion is something I think is also worth talking about today, as well as nature. And then I thought also we could say something about the style of Dimple Hill in comparison to the earlier volumes of Pilgrimage, because I think that we are now, like in the second half of the sequence, the style changes quite dramatically from the first volumes, as I'm sure you've noticed. So I have some questions that I brought with me for you to talk about, well, for us to talk about really, in relation to all of these topics. And I was just discussing with Brad before how we're going to do this. If you want me to first finish speaking and then we'll talk, or if you want to talk with me while I'm speaking, so to speak, as I'm going through these different topics. So any suggestions for that?
Well, I can say, Annika, I think this is a mature audience, and so we're happy to jump in and have and talk as we go along, I think.
Yeah, that sounds great. And I'm thinking that, I mean, if we don't have time for all of it, then, I mean, so be it, because there's so much to say, really.
Right.
Okay, then. So let's talk a little bit about Dimple Hill. This is the 12th volume in the Pilgrimage series, and Richardson probably began working on it around 1933, shortly after she completed Clear Horizon, and she sent it off to her publisher in August 1937. So it took her quite some time to get this short volume down onto paper, and she struggled quite a bit in writing it. She was ill for some time. She was short of money, as always. Very worried about that, and she wasn't sure it would be published. And in many ways, as Brad, you already mentioned, it constitutes a departure from what has come before in Pilgrimage. And I'm thinking that might also have been a challenge for her in writing it, because she had to sort of find her way to this new environment, right? In Dimple Hill, Miriam leaves London for East Sussex for a whole new kind of life, people largely with new characters, even though some of the old cast is still present. And she goes to East Sussex. And I have a little map here to show you that I've stolen from Wikipedia to show you just where East Sussex is, if you didn't know. So where Richardson herself went and where Miriam goes in Dimple Hill is sort of in the middle of East Sussex. And I also found some pictures that I think you've already seen. And Brad, I've stolen one of them from you. So this is what it would have looked like to Richardson at the time that she went to East Sussex to live herself. So Dimple Hill deals with a period in Richardson's life when she also left London for Sussex. She went there first in 1907 to recuperate from a breakdown. And we understand in the novel that Miriam has also suffered some sort of breakdown, something similar. Richardson then left, but she returned in 1908. And at that point, she also resigned permanently from her position as a dental secretary in London. And this is when she went to stay with a Quaker family, who in real life were called the Penroses, but in Dimple Hill, they, of course, become the Roscorlas. And she stayed with this family for an unknown amount of time, possibly for as long as until 1911, but we don't really know. But we do know that it was during this period that she began writing. So it was a very important part of her life in this sense, because she started to produce these prose sketches that are called middles, that she published in the Saturday Review and other places. So we see all of this lived experience reflected in Dimple Hill, in which Richardson seems to sort of have condensed these years of living in Sussex into this period during which Miriam stays with the Roscorlas, which in the novel is only about 150 pages, right? So it's not a very long novel. And I think that the way that she has summarized her lived experience of this period into this rather short volume, I think that we see an attempt to start to conclude Pilgrimage, even though Richardson herself certainly did not see herself as doing that at the time of writing. She later called it a cul-de-sac rather than a conclusion. She was under some pressure to finish the entire work, the entire novel, mostly from her new publisher, Dent, who told her in 1936 that they counted on the new installment as being the final one, so that they could publish all of Pilgrimage in its entirety in this omnibus edition that they were planning and that Brad showed you. And that eventually appeared in 1938 together with Dimple Hill. And let's see, switch, here it is. So this is the Dent edition. I think that Brad, you had the Knopf edition, right? Yeah. This is the edition then that Dimple Hill finally appeared in, also together with Richardson's enigmatic foreword to the entire series that I don't know if you've talked about here, but it sort of, I think, requires a meeting of its own, maybe, because it's really difficult to make sense of some of it. So while Richardson herself then did not feel that she had actually finished Pilgrimage, and while she did keep on writing afterwards, I think it's worth emphasizing the special place that Dimple Hill holds in the Pilgrimage series. So to begin with, it's the penultimate volume of the entire novel. So we are nearing the actual end of the text, if not the end of the work as Richardson had imagined it. It's also the last complete installment, since March Moonlight is so fragmentary and, quite frankly, incomplete. It's not a finished novel. All of these things might play in when we read this novel chapter, I think, because we as readers, we sort of start to mentally prepare ourselves for leaving Pilgrimage, even though that might not have been Richardson's plan. So we might think a bit about this idea of an ending and what we might expect from a conclusion to a novel as long as Pilgrimage, over 2,000 pages, although right now slightly underneath. So a contemporary critic of the omnibus edition, R.A. Scott James, was a famous writer at the time. He emphasized that the novel, when it was published in 1938, seemed it emphasized how its seeming lack of an ending, saying that it's nonetheless complete because it leads us nowhere. And I think that this is an unfair statement, and that there are things that do feel concluding in this novel. And one of them is this idea of Miriam coming home into herself, finding herself in a way in these moments of contemplation and silence that plays such an important role in Dimple Hill, both in terms of the silence during the Quaker meetings and with the Roscorla family, but also the silence that Miriam experiences on her own and through which she accesses a central part of herself. So if we compare this novel chapter with Pointed Roofs way back in the beginning of the series, we find this quote here. This is when, just in the last chapter of Pointed Roofs, when Miriam is leaving Germany, she feels that she's leaving empty-handed, having achieved nothing. So in the sense, there's this feeling in Pointed Roofs, right, that nothing really happens, nothing has changed. But in Dimple Hill, on the other hand, Miriam has perhaps not achieved as much in the sense of what she would call becoming, that is sort of actually producing anything worth something in the external world, but she has achieved tons, I think, in terms of her own being, this inner place that she reaches through moments of silence and contemplation. She is so much more at home in herself, I think. So even though this romance with Richard sort of comes to nothing, and her romance with the Quakers also seems to come to nothing, this is what Miriam wishes, I think, because she realizes that she came to Dimple Hill to heal herself, and she has found a connection with herself that is really important. So this is something that I thought that maybe we could start by talking a little bit about, this relation to the title itself, this idea of a pilgrimage, which has a very, has religious connotations, right? And where you think Miriam's pilgrimage is leading, and in terms of her pilgrimage, can you see any signs of her arriving anywhere towards the end of it in Dimple Hill? So that's my first question for the group. So I see that Karin has raised her hand. I'm not sure how you want to do this, Brad. Do you want to call on people, or should I?
Feel free to call on people, folks, if you want to raise your hand and follow the protocol. But if you want to chime in at an appropriate point, feel free to do that as well.
Okay. Well, I just wanted to say thank you, Annika, already for such a wonderful introduction to Dimple Hill. It really resonates for me with my experience of reading it. And I think what your question is really fantastic as well. And I was reflecting at the end of it that it sort of feels like, thinking of all 12 volumes, that the pilgrimage is Miriam's journey to find herself. And there's a sort of sequence of shedding identities that every group she meets and belongs to for a time, she finds at some moment there's a sort of rupture, and that happens with the Quakers, although it feels like the Quaker group is the one that she could almost belong to. But at the very end of the novel, those last couple of sentences, you feel that she's back on the pilgrimage again. She's leaving this group as well, but she has connected in a much deeper way with herself. So those were just a few thoughts I had.
Yeah, no, I think that you're absolutely right in that. And I think also that Rachel Mary says at one point that Miriam is a Quaker in all but name.
Yes.
So I think that Miriam has this fear of becoming anything too much, right? I mean, she doesn't want to name herself as anything. She doesn't want to categorize herself, but she still takes with her this Quaker philosophy as part of her, I think.
Yes, and that's quite Eastern. I know you've got religion on the list further down for what you want to talk about, but her sort of resistance to having a specific named identity is quite connected with some of the Eastern traditions. And I've been fascinated with that through the process of reading Pilgrimage as well. Although I know this book is about, obviously, Quaker and Christianity a little bit, but I think there's something Eastern lurking in there. So I don't know if you have anything to say about that, but it's just something I've been interested in.
I don't really, and I'm not really sure to what extent Richardson engaged with Eastern philosophies either, but it's certainly something that's worth looking into. Thank you so much for that. Yes, I think Susana, are you next? You're next on my list.
I think so. Thank
Yeah.
you. I think the tone overall in this installment is of maturity. Away or behind are the hesitations, the insecurities. She's much more assertive in any way, and I feel like she's like checking out past experiences, like, okay, I'm through with the Lycurgans. I'm behind. I'm not going back to my old job. She's sort of taking. She's crossing out in many of the things and taking her own stand, not following somebody else's as she may have done. So it's like she's done with the experimenting and taking her own path.
Yeah, I think so too. And I see that especially in these scenes where she sort of feels like she is moving inwards instead of outwards. So if she's been searching for an identity in these different constellations before and in her relationship, now she is instead moving inwards. And as you say, there's great maturity in that. Absolutely. I have somebody here who is Moon P.
Oh, my name is Rebecca. Sorry. I'm a little bit technologically challenged. I thought that she was coming to realize that she was a writer, that this is discovering that she's a writer. And in particular, in chapter 8, there's a line about how Amabel brought up all of these stories from her, brought back these memories. And it's almost like this is a reference to Pilgrimage, the book that she's writing, that she's talking about the genesis of what we are reading, which is very postmodern, but nonetheless, there it is. It says that it's a tale told long ago of someone who is not quite herself. And so you can see that it is, Miriam is her, but not her. And I think it's about coming to realize that this is her calling.
I think so too. And in March Moonlight, there is much more about her starting to write. I think that you really enjoyed that. But there's also this sense of, like, in March Moonlight, these scenes in Dimple Hill where she has this experience of silence and of journeying inward. She uses that word of journeying inwards. Those experiences in Dimple Hill become very concretely associated with her writing in March Moonlight, so that she writes from this place within that she learns to access much more concretely in Dimple Hill. So there is that connection with her writing, absolutely.
Thank you.
Phyllis?
Hi, thank you. It's a thrill to see you in person. I've really enjoyed some of your journal articles from the Dorothy Richardson Journal, especially the narration thing and the use of time. And this is Rebecca. I want to key in on and sort of take this in another, it's like a tennis match. I'm going to take it in a slightly different direction, but same ball, which is I am fascinated by Miriam, I'll call it Miriam for now, her attitude towards writing and reading. And you mentioned at one point that there are sort of two nows. And sometimes I think there are three nows, I'm not sure, but the sense, I didn't realize this until I read your article when I was almost finished with Dimple Hill. I didn't realize that this period in her life is when she started writing. And yet it is the almost last thing she wrote about. And here I'm getting involved in a kind of a Mobius strip thing, but I find, and then she's had comments through all the books about how, why do people just read the book from the beginning? Just pick it up in the middle and start reading, and don't, read the last line first. It shouldn't matter. And And so I get the sense that she's sort of, and then you see references in Dimple Hill to things that are, from many volumes before, and you see references in the earlier volumes to things that are in Dimple Hill, and or they repeat. Let's put it that way. So I really feel as if she's taking us on a journey through time in a really sophisticated way. I mean so she waited 30 years to write this, and yet that is the beginning of Miriam's pilgrimage, but it's also the end. So I'd like to hear some of your, because you have some really good thoughts on all this, the nows of Miriam. I'd love to have people hear that too.
Thank you so much for reading my work. Absolutely. I have actually a quotation later that I think captured this idea of the two Miriams, but well, in short, what I suggest in this article that I wrote a couple of years ago is that there are two Miriams in Pilgrimage. So we have the character Miriam, and then we have an older Miriam who is narrating her own story. And she surfaces here and there, and we can see this in the text, how there's a switch in tone, and suddenly we hear like a different voice coming in and commenting on something that the character Miriam is experiencing, but that the narrating Miriam sees differently because of all this time in between. So that there are two time frames constantly. And towards the end of Pilgrimage, and I think in Dimple Hill and most noticeably in March Moonlight, really, this becomes much more prevalent. So we very often have this discrepancy where we don't really seem to be in the moment with Miriam anymore, but we seem to look at her from a distance with the older Miriam, who is reflecting on, well, what was this like, this discrepancy. And I'm thinking that it might also have something to do with the fact that the older Richardson got, the more trouble she had in accessing Miriam's mind again, because she felt that she didn't completely identify anymore with her younger self. I mean, because so much time had passed, and I think that's probably natural. And I think that this is sort of reflected in the narrative in this way, that she is looking at Miriam very differently in the end of the sequence as compared to in the beginning. This is really complicated, and I think it helps to see some quotations when talking about it. But I hope that sort of answered your question in some way.
Yes, thank you.
And we can return to that with a quotation that I have later on in relation to the style of Dimple Hill. Max.
Hi, thanks, Annika. Yeah, what I want to say really followed on from those great comments from Karin and Rebecca and Phyllis in particular. I've also been puzzled by that question of what the pilgrimage is in Pilgrimage and where it's leading, and it seems to me that it's wonderfully kind of unknowing about that. That there is a sense in which it's hovering between a religious sense of sort of finding a core, or finding a truth, and something that is leading to a much more aesthetic sense of finding herself as a writer. But it started to make much more sense in this volume to me, particularly in that passage where she's in the garden looking at the delphiniums, that intense blue that she needs to find the right words for. So it is about being a writer, but it's also about just seeing things differently. And what she likes about the Quakers is that she thinks their silence and their way of being together without actually kind of distracting each other enables them to see better. So that there's a sense of a kind of visionariness. I mean, I think she's a mystic, really, and she doesn't know where to put that mysticism, whether it's a religious thing or an aesthetic thing. But the question is for her to work out what it is and what she does with it. And that did feel like a key moment, really. And she says it's it sort of has a strange power, and it's making a statement of some kind. The blue of the delphiniums makes a statement. That's a wonderful moment, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And there are many such moments in nature, I think, when she feels like she is in communion with nature, and as though nature is sort of speaking to her, or responding to something in her. That there's this idea, absolutely. And I think you're right that she is a mystical person, a very spiritual person too. I think that we very often, Miriam says a couple of things in the early volumes about how she's not religious, she doesn't want to go to church, etc. And it has often been taken as her being sort of an atheist or an agnostic, but I don't think that's it at all, actually. I think her problem is with organized religion. And it's the same problem that she has in relation to many of these groups that we've already spoken about, that she doesn't want to belong to anything in particular, and that she especially doesn't like the fact that a man stands up in church and tells her what to think. And that's what the Quakers don't do, because they don't have somebody who speaks to the congregation in that sense. Everybody shares equally, sits in silence together, and if anyone is moved to speak, they speak. And that sort of equality is something that I think deeply attracts her, as well as the silence, on many different levels, as you say. Also, the silence in the family. I think there's so much to be said about this. And she says at some point in Dimple Hill that if only people realize what can be found in silence, I mean, not just in these meetings, but if we could bring this into our everyday life, everything would change, right? So there is something that really, really speaks to her in this way of living, I think. Julia, you've been waiting to say something now.
Oh, this is a really minor point after this very big point, but I think one of the things that's so interesting to me in Dimple Hill is how the I leaks through. I mean, the word I, that sometimes, you know, it has happened throughout the book, and we talked about it a little bit in the last meeting, but in Dimple Hill, it comes that Miriam will be talking, Miriam did this, and the voice will drop into, I thought this, I did that. And it's like the union of that as all the sort of, you know, as she's putting together this tapestry of her own experience, and then that drops into the first person is really strong. And your very good point about who is the first person? Is it older Miriam who's writing this? Is it Richardson? I don't even know who that I is, you know, but having gone to graduate school in the days of deconstructionism, I'm always really attentive to these little details, like that whether that I is situated in Richardson the writer or Miriam the writer of her own story. But all the points people have been making throughout this discussion about how she understands that she's growing into herself and becoming clearer in herself, and then that sort of shows up in the text as this bleeding between Miriam I is so interesting to me, and I'm interested to know your thoughts on it.
Absolutely. And it's not only that the narration changes from the third person to the first person, but it also sometimes changes into present tense. So we have these shifts between all these different levels going on. And as in this article that we spoke about before, I discussed this in relation to time, and how Richardson had a very specific and a very strange way of looking at time that she expressed in Pilgrimage. Shirley Rose has written a really excellent article about this that I recommend. But where she felt, both Richardson and Miriam, that when she had these moments of contemplation, when she went into herself, as she starts to do in Dimple Hill, she could sort of access her past. And it's as though it is present for her, as though it's happening again. So if we connect that to the narration and to these switches where she goes into the first person and into the present tense, you can sort of see almost that it's like the older narrating Miriam is suddenly back in the present of what she's narrating, and it's become so real to her that she's no longer just telling us about Miriam, she is there. It's happening to me right now. And that's when we have the first person, the present tense. So that's how I see those switches in tense and person, which I think is one of the most fascinating aspects actually of pilgrimage. And the way that she does this, I mean, sometimes in the very same sentence, she can switch. And it works, I think, at least. Okay, is it okay if I continue and talk a little bit more now?
Absolutely.
Yeah, so I thought that I would say something, let's see where we are. Let's see what's on the next slide. Right, I wanted to say something about style. The style in Dimple Hill, and I think in the later parts of Pilgrimage, this isn't something that's perhaps particular for Dimple Hill, but it's very, very different from the earlier volumes of Pilgrimage, which I'm sure you've realized, having read through all of it. So this here is a passage from Pointed Roofs again, and I'm not going to read it, but I just thought that I'd show it to you so that you can remember what it was like way back then. So we see that this passage here is very heavily sprinkled with Richardson's signature punctuation mark, the ellipses. Which seemingly they represent Miriam's thought processes, right? And gaps and things that can't be expressed in words, and we're moving from concept to concept, from thought to thought, right? And then we have another passage, and this one is from Interim. This is the original version of Interim, so not the Virago one that you might have read. And here we have not proper sentences really with full stops, but we have dashes in between lines, and we're moving from dialogue to action without the text clearly signaling what is what. So both of these passages that are from the 1910s, they are very focused on impressions and on capturing the lived moment and what it was like to live in this moment, life as it is experienced by just one individual. But if we turn instead to Dimple Hill, and some of the later volumes in the series, we find a very different kind of text, right? So this is a passage that comes very early in this novel. Exactly as on this first morning, the town's most prominent feature was rousing them to headlong activity. So on that far-off day, whose frustrations could still torment her, they had been moved immediately to toil, through fierce noonday heat, to the church on the high hill, thereby setting at an impossible distance the little valley by the sea. The enchanting toy railway had brought so conveniently near, and when serenely in the cool of the late afternoon they might have climbed to the church and surveyed its famous brasses with eyes already satisfied. So here we have a very long sentence. This is just one sentence, and it's very full of subclauses set apart with commas, and we almost need two readings in order to properly understand what is going on here and what is important. And to me, there's something very Proustian about this long sentence, and we can compare it just very briefly to one of Proust's own sentences. This is one of the longest sentences in À la Recherche. This is from Swan's Wake. I'm not going to read it, so don't worry. I just wanted to show it to you. So here we also have this long sentence with long subclauses and lots of commas and dashes and things, taking us here and there, sort of meandering. And I think another reason to mention Proust in relation to Richardson's later style is that she once wrote that, or she said about herself that she wrote through consciousness, while Proust wrote about consciousness. And I think that's really an apt distinction for the first half of Pilgrimage. But when we come to Dimple Hill here, I'm not so sure anymore that it holds, because I don't think that we are experiencing the world of pilgrimage through Miriam's mind anymore. I think that she's writing about Miriam's mind now. So there's this change there, and please disagree with me if you want to. I wanted just to look at another passage from Dimple Hill that I think is relevant here, also in relation to what we spoke about earlier about the two Miriams. So this is from later in the novel. Her words had summoned Eve and a true tale, and while I hesitated, taken up with the realization that at last it was possible to think of the dead Eve, Miss Roscorla had gone on, talking of long tramps, the little shaw, the woods beyond the village, the places she had found long ago and wanted to see again. And the sound of her voice deepened the glow of everything she touched, and I was sure that if she really did find time to join me on my walks, I should still see everything as I did when alone, as one could with a member of one's own family. And then came that moment that cast a darkness and left me desolate, and the homestead chilled and darkened. But even then, when for an instant I tried to realize the Quaker point of view, the light began to return. So here, to me, we don't have a narrative filtered through a consciousness, at least not in the same way as we did with the earlier passages that I showed you from Pointed Roofs and Interim. What's happened here is that the perspective seems to have shifted. So instead of looking at life through the experiencing Miriam's consciousness, we have a narrator looking at Miriam from some distance. And I think we especially see this in the last lines here, which also raises, I think, the question of that is this possibly then an older Miriam looking back at herself? Because she seems to describe a memory here rather than the lived experience. So this is my second question to you. How would you describe Richardson's style in Dimple Hill? Do you think it's different from what you've read before? And which of Richardson's styles do you prefer, and why? It's a difficult question to throw at you, perhaps.
It's a great question. I'd love to see what people say.
Did you find that, I mean, the part of style is how easy a text is to read, I think. So that might be something that's related here. Did you find that Dimple Hill was easier or more difficult to get into than the other ones? Phyllis?
Yes, that was my question, because I really, when I first, from the moment I started this, I loved it. I just felt like I was in some world that I didn't understand, but I wanted to stay in, and Miriam's mind and all like that. And then Dimple Hill, the beginning of it was the first time I was really, really struggling at the start. And so I haven't had time to go back and figure out why. And maybe you can tell me, but and I know she had trouble beginning the book. And I'm just assuming that there was some sand in the gears as she was kind of leaving the permanently present Miriam for somewhere else and couldn't quite get it. But I would be curious to know if other people had the same feeling, because I was really shocked that, I mean, some of the other passages and stuff, you know, you come to have to reread them like 3 times because you forgot which clause goes where, but I didn't mind. It was like, oh, I'll do another lap in the pool. That's fine. I can do that. But Dimple Hill, I had problems with until it sort of got to the Quakers, and then it was very easy to follow. But it almost felt Bronte-esque as opposed to, anyway, so I wonder what other people think.
Is it a bad thing that it's Bronte-esque?
Well, the Quakers, I mean, that whole scene of the, you know, Richard and the silent stoic farmer and bringing in, I mean, as a facile analogy, but it just didn't have quite as much mysticism to me as the other stuff did. That's all. Yeah.
I can see that, and I think that it takes some time for her to get started in Dimple Hill. And I think that the second half of the novel chapter, when the sentences start to become shorter again, and the chapters become shorter too, and there's
Yes.
a little bit more dialogue, it is a little bit easier to read. Karin, what do you say?
I think in a way I had the opposite response to it. So when I remember when I started Pointed Roofs, I just loved it, and I loved that style, and it was really helpful to see the quotation you put up and remember that shortness and the ellipses and all of that. And I actually struggled, I think, more with the style, I don't know which volume, but in the middle of Pilgrimage. And I felt with Dimple Hill, I agree with what Phyllis said and what you've said about the opening being a little bit sort of finding one's way, the writer finding one's way, and us as readers finding our way. But once I was into Dimple Hill, I felt it actually made coherent things which I'd felt we had glimpses of from Pointed Roofs. So where she often talks in the earlier books, I noticed the use of it, where she would comment on something deep beneath the surface. I do have quotes somewhere of examples of this. And it was something she was trying to make contact with. And in Dimple Hill, she's able to coherently make contact with it and describe it. And it is what you said about making that contact with the inner voice within, which she's kind of touched momentarily in earlier books. And so I just felt Dimple Hill was a delight to read because that contact was being made and it was so exciting. So that was my reaction to it.
That's really wonderful. I often feel in those parts of Pilgrimage where, I mean, it is a bit dense sometimes and difficult to get through, but it's always worthwhile to really work with the text, because what Richardson has to say is usually something that, at least to me, resonates very deeply. And sometimes, I mean, I've read Pilgrimage so many times now, but when I come back to it after a break, sometimes I realize how much she's colored my way of looking at the world in ways that haven't been super clear to me before I could see it a little bit from a distance. And it precisely has to do with these things of her way of her distinction between, you know, being and becoming, and this idea of moving inwards.
Yeah, I think in Dimple Hill, there's one of the most accurate and painstaking descriptions of the process of meditation. As somebody who's read a lot of yogic texts, the ancient scriptures, she's actually captured it in a modernist novel in amazing ways. And I know it's in relation to the Quakers, but it's the same process where she talks about going deeper, and she talks about some of the transitional places between waking and sleeping. It's really quite incredible writing.
Yeah, I think so too. Absolutely. Thank you so much for that. Max.
Yeah, I do get what the others are saying about this, but I wanted to put in a slightly sort of dissentient voice at this point, because it seems to me that I don't know, I found I was struggling with this volume in a different way. I mean, I thought the style of the passage you quoted seemed to me as much like Henry James's like Proust, you know, that there was that kind of striving for, straining for a certain kind of complexity, but I felt the subject matter didn't really live up to that. You know, what it feels like she's settling for something less interesting than she's been dealing with in the other volumes. I mean, I found myself on the edge of my seat when I was reading about Michael or the Lycurgans or Amabel, or, you know, a lot of those earlier sort of more social novels. And the Quaker, in a sense, what she likes about the Quakers is she can leave society while, you know, she can be with people but not talk to them. And it creates a kind of lessening of tension in the book, which seems like a problem for me, I'm afraid.
I can see that too, and I can see that this might have been part of the problem too for Richardson in writing this volume, that she before she had dealt with sort of externals and relationships and Miriam going here and Miriam going there. And this time she was writing instead about inner experiences. And that strikes me as something much more difficult to write, perhaps in the same riveting way. My favorite volume, I'm going to confess, is The Tunnel, precisely because there is so much energy in it. I mean, there's this, when Miriam, she just rushes up and down the stairs at the dental practice, and she goes here and she goes there, and there are so many characters, and you get this sense of a bustling London life, and I love that, really. And this is something so completely different, and she's really, relishing in this silence, and it's very difficult to make that come alive on the page, I think. So it might also be perhaps that the tempo is very slow in many ways here, which makes for difficult reading. Perhaps.
To me, if I can jump in, I think, for one thing, as you pointed out, the style evolves. And it's almost like as the books go on, Richardson is training us how to read her. So I would not be inclined to give someone Dimple Hill. That's kind of like the steepest part of the rock face in the ascent of Mount Pilgrimage, so to speak. And that's not where you start somebody. You have to start them. And even Dimple, even Dawn's Left Hand with Kim and Amy, they both said that, essentially they'd been helicoptered in and dropped mid ascent on a very difficult text, and they really struggled until they kind of gave into it. And as I tweeted that I was struggling with Dimple Hill, going through it again myself, but then we did this session with Scott. And he reminded us that Richardson often felt like it was as important to listen as to read. And so I kind of said, okay, fine, just go with the flow of the words, read them all, but don't get obsessed with the meaning of each word, which is something, if you do that with Richardson, it's going to take a long time. Because these are such long, as the book goes on, it becomes more and more complex. Yeah. I feel like part of what was going on with Dimple Hill is she was struggling she was struggling with a different perspective, different subjects, but even a different aspect of consciousness that she was trying to communicate. And she was running out of energy. She was running out of time. This book was a real struggle with her to finish. And the fact that even March Moonlight, it got harder and harder as time went along. We have to remember she was 60 plus when she was doing this, and it wasn't a comfortable 60. It was a 60 where she was spending every day, cooking in, probably not the warmest environments, with meager rations, and a husband who didn't exactly give her a lot of support from a practical standpoint. So she really, you can see this is a writer. I think you can sense the struggle that was going on in producing this book. And if it seems tortuous at times, it's because it was that experience for her.
I think you're right about that. Absolutely. And I really like this analogy you had with rock climbing, especially like when you open Dimple Hill and the first half of it, it's just big blocks of text. So there's nothing really to hang on to, like if you have a dialogue, at least there's some cliffs you can step on, but not in this novel. Absolutely. Yeah. Let's see where we are time-wise. It's already, well, it's 9 o'clock with me, so we've sort of hit the target. So do you want to keep going?
Well, this is completely up to you. We are people will stick in. We normally aim for an hour as a reasonable time. So if you want to start wrapping up, we can do that now. Or we can continue for another, 15, 20 minutes.
Well, I have some things to say also about nature. So maybe we could,
Please.
it really relates to what we've spoken about already, but I can go through that too. I just wanted to ask, Phyllis, you still have your hand up. Is it because you wanted to say something or because you forgot it?
Well, just quickly, because I want to hear what you have to say about nature. But again, when we get into the different nows of the book, we don't necessarily know that somebody reading Dimple Hill had read all other 12, right? Or other 11. And just what you were saying at your beginning, that we sort of sense that this is the end of it because we're sitting here having read it all. But the difference in the meta difference between what a reader would be experiencing and what she's trying to express. I'm not sure how aware she was of that, but that's
Well,
something
I would
that's
let's remember that she knew this was going to be the final volume, and as she was writing it, Dent communicated that it was going to be packaged as a collected edition and not published as a separate volume. I mean, she knew that before she finished the manuscript.
Okay.
And so I think her expectation was that that most readers would have approached it after reading more of it. And I think in particular, I can't imagine anybody reading the chapters where Amabel and Michael are mentioned. I mean, she assumes the reader has the history that Miriam had, so to speak, in those characters. In Dimple Hill, they just appear out of nowhere with no communication. And while that's, Richardson never gives us a lot of crutches. For me, it's hard to see those chapters being read and understood by anybody who didn't have some history of what had happened in previous volumes.
I think with Dimple Hill in particular, I mean, it was published as part of a volume with the other novel chapters too. So readers would have at least had to go through them to get to Dimple Hill. But I think that this is a really interesting question, actually. I mean, I encountered Richardson, as I'm guessing you have, in the Virago editions, which means that you read them as one long novel, and there's no, I mean, it says, okay, now one novel ends and the other begins, but you just keep reading. So it is sort of like you read a Pilgrimage as one novel. But then I started collecting the original versions as they were first published. And now I actually prefer to read them to reading the Virago edition. And it makes me so much more aware of the fact that they were published individually as separate novels, and you start reading them as separate novels too. So it's an entirely different reading experience, actually. It's a really interesting thing to bring up, I think, these different ways of reading and what the paratext, so to speak, what they add to our understanding of the text. Okay, so yes, let's talk a little bit about nature. I think that another reason why Dimple Hill feels a bit slower in tempo than the earlier volumes, and I think we already touched upon this actually, is how it is very often preoccupied with descriptions instead of action and dialogue. So there's a lot of descriptions of nature and Miriam's experiences of nature. And this is something that it has in common with Oberland, which you've also read. So these two novels feel like the two nature chapters of Pilgrimage. And one thing that they have in common is that they connect Miriam's explorations of her inmost self that she accesses through silence, etc., what she would call her being, with her engagement with the natural world surrounding her. In fact, in both of these novels, Oberland and Dimple Hill, Miriam's inner world tends to blend with the outer world so that it at times becomes difficult for her to distinguish very clearly the boundaries between herself and the nature that surrounds her. So in a sense, the landscapes in both Oberland and Dimple Hill, then they become mindscapes in a very sort of romantic blurring of self and nature. And the journeys that she makes to Switzerland and Sussex, respectively, also become journeys inside what she finds in these places is herself rather than where she goes geographically. And one way that this inner experience is emphasized in Dimple Hill in particular is how Miriam very deeply appreciates the silence that she encounters, both within the Quaker community, of course, but also in nature. And this connection between silence and nature is present in Richardson's writing from the very start. And in fact, in 1908, when she was herself staying with the Penroses in Sussex, she began writing these short prose sketches that we spoke about, her middles. And already from the start, as we can see in this passage that is up here now, she emphasizes this connection between silence and nature and of being one with the surrounding world. Shut away in the cool green stillness, it was for a moment as if the woodlands towering unseen above you were once more welcoming and intimate as they had been in June, when you could, once the arresting marvel of spring vanished into full leafage, step at any moment from the dusty highway into a tender silence. But this morning, when you were still the ceaseless sound of a million tiny hummings made you an interloper, told you you might, if you pleased, walk through the busy forest, but only by treading out the pathway of death. You must wait for your woods. Even the gentle wind of summer may not pass through now. So this is one of the characteristics of these middles that she wrote, is that she very often used you in describing the protagonist, which is really interesting, I think. Right, so these sketches then emphasize this connection between nature and silence, which she then brought with her into Pilgrimage. And there is, in these scenes also, or in these middles and in the nature scenes in Oberland and in Dimple Hill, this feeling of healing through nature, which is of course relevant in a novel where Miriam goes out into nature to recuperate from a breakdown. And I think it also connects very strongly to how we today talk about things like forest bathing and such things, which at least in Sweden is very often sort of like people are told by their physicians to go out into forest when they are suffering from burnout, etc. And I think this is exactly what Miriam is doing in Dimple Hill when she has had this breakdown and she goes out into nature and she's healed by being there in this other way of being. So these middles that she started writing when she was in Sussex sort of form a basis for Dimple Hill, to the extent that one of them, a prose sketch called A Sussex Auction, was reworked into one of the later chapters in Dimple Hill. So it seems that as a way of going back to this period in her life when she began writing and when Miriam starts to write, or at least thinking about writing, Richardson returned to these texts that she wrote, and she used them sort of as a way of getting into this material. So you can see some of these same ideas developed in Dimple Hill, this communication with nature and how it seems to speak to her and to something deep and almost innate in Miriam. And I'm wondering, I think this is a better passage perhaps to focus on. So this is fairly early in the novel when she has arrived in Sussex. Streaming from the misty rain-soaked meadows, visible whenever a gate passed by, the outer air poured into her being, describing those meadows, miles of them covering the earth in all directions, solitary, averted in the dim light, breathing out secretly, unnoticed, the evening fragrance of all that grew in them, claiming her not as something added to the rest, but as her known companions, left behind long ago, and now returned to and demanding forgetfulness of everything but themselves, for whom they declared she had mistaken the strangers at the top of the hill. So this passage is, to me, quite strongly connected to this idea of Miriam, both finding herself, but also her spiritual awakening, or her spiritual return, rather, because as it's described in these passages, she sort of finds something that has always been in her, like she comes back to it. And there is also, to me, something religious here in how she is finding nature, speaking to her, and herself being part of nature. So this is my final question to you. Okay, I had all sorts of passages here, apparently. And that is what role you think that religion plays for Miriam in Pilgrimage at large, and in Dimple Hill in particular, and if you think that religion is connected to nature or silence, or both in some way. And we've already touched upon this a little bit, but maybe you have some further comments to make here.
Well, I'll just chime in, and I think it's already been mentioned, but the question to me is it religion or is it spirituality? And that, you know, one of the things that she really appreciates in the Quakers, as you already mentioned, was that she's no longer being dictated to, she's no longer fitting within a structure of a service, you know, because particularly growing up, and if she was going to Church of England services every week, the script never, the words never change, but the words change from week to week, but the menu never changes, does it? I mean, there is a pattern to the service, and it's completely predictable, and probably over the years, that's one of the things that she found quite stifling.
Yeah, and I think also this fact that it would be a man standing up there telling her what to think, when she very much felt that, hey, I can think for myself.
Right. Right.
So this is something that would have attracted her a lot with the Quakers, this idea that everyone would be equal before God and before religion. So nobody had any more right than anyone else to interpret scripture or to tell people what they should or shouldn't think. I feel that maybe we have emptied the conversation here.
Well, I think that Mikey makes a comment, and it's worth, reflecting on the fact that the opening scene in Dimple Hill is really this, visit to the cathedral. And she said, why pounce upon the cathedral? I mean, there's a perfect example. Grace and Florence want to do what every tourist does, which is go inside and look at it, whereas Miriam's instinct is more to stand off and kind of observe and take in being in the presence of this magnificent cathedral before she starts checking off her, the checklist of what every tourist should see.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's sort of the thing with Dimple Hill, that she finds the cathedral out in nature. Well, I mean, she's already done that in previous volumes too, but it becomes much more prevalent here, that she keeps going out and she feels that something happens to her, right? Something speaks to her, and she hears it inside herself. Yeah. And we have lots of comments in the chat here now. I see. Thank you, Phyllis.
Annika, can I ask if you would return me as host, and then we'll kind of wrap up the discussion,
Yes.
which has been wonderful. I think everybody would agree.
I have a quick observation, if I may. It seems to me that this book, perhaps this is not quite related to the religion aspect, but it's almost like through the Quakers, she found a way to shed herself of everything. There's even a little aside about intermittent feminism, and that she was letting go of her feminism. And I find that really fascinating that she, at the end, she's letting go of Amabel, and she was very fond of Amabel, but she says, you know, you're going to move on, you're going to find other people. And she says that, oh, who was her latest? The Richard, that he was now nothing. Now, we know that this character, Miriam, can tell herself stories all the time, tell herself lies about what she's feeling. But it seems like this whole book, Dimple Hill, is just shedding one thing after another, and getting down to that core, to that quiet silence. And I think that I don't know how that ties into religion, and yet it is a kind of a spiritual thing to not be attached to anything. That's kind of that Eastern thought that someone brought up earlier, that she would want to let go of everything that she found even at all important, except perhaps nature.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I'm thinking when I'm listening to you also that, I mean, she is shedding everyone, but she's choosing herself for the first time, really. I mean, this is what it's about, right? She's
Yes.
choosing herself, and the writing comes from that, I think. I'm also thinking that there's this scene in the novel when Amabel and Michelle come to visit her, and Amabel says, I don't know how you can stand it here, those awful silences. And to me, that really captures like the discrepancy between Amabel and Miriam. I mean, it really shows how she doesn't understand Miriam. And there's also this scene at the end with Hypo when he's like, oh, I want to come and look at them, you know? And she's like, well, you wouldn't see them if you did. And this really shows how far she's come. I mean, that she has, she's shed them, she's let go, she's becoming her own person, and she's moved on.
Yeah.
I'm reminded of the old Groucho Marx jokes that I wouldn't want to be a member of a club that would have me as a member. And that's kind of what Miriam is saying, is that here's all these different clubs that I could belong to, but frankly, each one of them expects that you conform to a certain, behavior mode. And that's really what she finds. I mean, her relationship with Hypo says, we can be in this relationship, but you have to do this. And with Amabel, we can be in this relationship, but you have to behave like this. The Lycurgians, you've got to do this. These are all these situations where she, I'm reminded my wife and I once took square dancing lessons, which was wonderful, but you quickly discover square dancers are a cult in America. And basically, if you don't agree to like go to 3 square dances a week, you're considered, you're a heretic, and you're cast out of the fold. So, that's part of what Miriam's going through. And to me, I think this is one of the things I love about this book is we do this. We go into situations and say, well, is this a place where I fit?
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of times we conform, we make a compromise. We give up something of our unique selves to conform to the group. Whereas Miriam, she's stubborn. She doesn't want to do that.
She is deeply individualistic. She is herself, and she can't not be herself.
True.
And I just want to make one other comment in terms of time frame, because that kind of recognition of the importance of embracing individualism as opposed to being a member of a group, there was a profound cultural shift towards that I believe came out of the experience of World War I, where, hundreds of thousands of troops, particularly in Britain and in France and also in Germany, were, forced to become, to train, to be soldiers, to be on the front, to take orders. And they realized, these guys are giving us orders and they're killing us. They have no idea what they're doing. And so maybe my whole premise that the upper class knows what they're doing has to be jettisoned, and I need to start taking care of myself. And you see that there's a lot of writings that start to come out in the 1920s of people kind of embracing their right to individualism as opposed to their obligation to fit within a group.
Yeah, I mean, you can see that modernism comes from this idea too, where it's no longer possible to describe reality objectively, but instead we have these subjective experiences of reality, which will be individual and original, each for every character, right? I mean, that's also that idea, how nature of experience, yeah.
Does anyone have any last comments or thoughts that they want to offer? This has been a fantastic discussion. I think we've all been thrilled to see all the avenues we wandered down. And again, it's just another example of what an amazing book this is, that you can, we've been talking for an hour and a half and we barely scratched the surface of one chapter volume, so to speak. Okay, if there are no other last comments, thank you, Annika, for staying up late to talk to this group. It's been fantastic.
Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, Max, did you want to offer something?
No, that was an applause hand rather than a
Okay, yeah, I was
question.
going to say,
Thanks very much.
I can guarantee you, if we could do a standing ovation here, we would be doing it, because it's been one of the best sessions we've ever had in this group. So much appreciated.
Thank you so much for having me, and I'm just so in awe that you're doing this. It's wonderful.
I have one comment. If anybody is interested, I just noticed this yesterday. Blackwell's in Oxford is selling a complete set of the 1938 Dent edition that you saw pictured. If you have 400 pounds that are burning a hole in your pocket, you can pick those up. Those complete sets are virtually, they show up like once a year. I'm very happy. I have a Knopf set and I also have the 67 Dent set, but if you love Pilgrimage and are willing to invest in it, those are special volumes.
Perfect Christmas gift.
I have a question, Brad.
Yeah.
Did your 1938 Knopf, is the paper going wonky on it?
What you mean is it's incredibly brittle. Yeah.
It is, okay. All right, well, I
Yeah.
have a partial collection and I didn't know if it was all of them. I almost turn a page and it chips. It's upsetting
Yeah.
a lot.
Oh, it's terribly. It was, Knopf, I think, was a little bit reluctant to even put it out, but they had made a deal to do it, so they did. So it's clearly, compared to the average 1930s book, it's low quality, and Knopf was not a low quality publisher.
Right,
So
right.
yeah,
I
it's a
have some of the
shame. I
individuals.
I wouldn't try reading it again because it's perishable.
Sad. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, this is, and just among us girls, so to speak. So I've been communicating with the McLean Agency, which holds Dorothy Richardson's rights, because the last, well, now 4 volumes are still under copyright if they were to be reissued here or in the UK. And so I've, been trying to reach out to them to say, what kind of terms would you want to have it reissued? Because Virago does not have right to publish those volumes in the United States. That's how bad this is. And so, and basically the agency is completely uninterested in even having a discussion about what legacy rights might be. And so this is not helping Richardson at all.
I read the last number of volumes on Kindle, so some sort of free thing that I.
Yes, well, there is.
You don't have the page numbers, and it's, but at least I'm not breaking the book I own.
Yeah, there is, and it is linked to on the site, because copyright laws are different in different places. You can get it. There is essentially a Project Gutenberg-like site in Canada that has made
that's what
all
this is.
13 volumes available.
And for free. I mean, if
Yeah,
not
for free. Yeah, as they should be. I
Well-
mean, none of this money. I mean, Dorothy Richardson's heirs are basically long gone, and there, it's not a lot of money involved anyway. It's just a shame. It's one of the reasons that Pilgrimage is still so unknown, is that if you can't get the book,
yeah, you
You're not
can't
gonna
teach
read
it.
it.
You can't get it for students.
yeah. Well, Annika, thank you so much for joining us and sharing your thoughts. It's been a spectacular session. This will be posted. I'll let everybody know when it's online. And I'm very tempted, I think I will do this, is to send out a call to all the members of the reading group to just answer in your own words that question that you asked at the beginning, which was, you know, what is the pilgrimage and where is it leading? Because that's a great kind of way to sum up our thoughts after we finish the next volume. So thank you for that as well. Okay, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us. It's been wonderful, and we will see you in January. Take care.
Bye.